The amplifier was still humming, a low, electric drone that filled the control room at the record plant in New York City like the pulse of something alive. It was past 2 in the morning, sometime during the spring of 1968, and the studio smelled like burnt coffee, stale cigarette smoke, and the sharp chemical tang of reel-to-reel tape baking under studio lights. Jimi Hendrix sat cross-legged on the floor with his white Stratocaster across his lap, headphones half on, half off, listening to a playback that nobody else in the room could hear. His eyes were closed. His fingers moved across the strings without pressing down, ghosting through chord shapes as if rehearsing a conversation with the instrument itself. He had been in this room for 14 hours straight. But the real story was not the music he was chasing. It was the silence building in the hallway outside, where the man who had stood beside him since the very beginning was about to reach his breaking point. Noel Redding leaned against the corridor wall with his bass case between his feet and a cigarette burning down to the filter between his fingers. He stared at the closed studio door, listening to the muffled hum of playback bleeding through the walls, and tried to remember the last time Jimi had asked for his opinion on anything. He could not. It had been weeks, maybe months. The bassist of the Jimi Hendrix Experience, the man who had been there from the London audition that started everything, the man who had played on every record, stood on every stage, traveled through every time zone of every tour, was standing in a hallway outside his own recording session, waiting to be invited back in. To understand what was about to happen inside that studio, you need to understand what had already happened outside of it. The Jimi Hendrix Experience was not supposed to be a dictatorship. When Chaz Chandler and manager Michael Jeffrey assembled the band in late 1966, the idea was a power trio. 3 musicians, 3 voices, 3 equal forces creating something that none of them could achieve alone. Noel Redding had been a guitarist before joining. He had auditioned for the New Animals, walked into the wrong room, and ended up playing bass for a left-handed American who could barely look people in the eye. That accident of timing had changed his life. Mitch Mitchell brought jazz-inflected drumming that gave the Experience its nervous, unpredictable energy, and Jimi brought everything else: the songs, the voice, the vision, the stage presence that could silence an arena with a single sustained note. But in the beginning, there was balance. Noel contributed arrangements. Mitch shaped the rhythmic feel. They were a band. Then something shifted. Success does strange things to the architecture of creative relationships. The bigger Jimi became, the more the center of gravity moved toward him. Not because he demanded it, not because he was cruel or dismissive, but because the world outside kept telling him he was the only one who mattered. Magazine covers featured Jimi alone. Interviewers asked about Jimi exclusively. Record executives addressed Jimi and treated Noel and Mitch like hired hands who happened to share the stage. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Jimi began to internalize that hierarchy. Not as ego, as responsibility. As if the world said the music was his alone, then the music was his alone to perfect. But what felt like artistic responsibility to Jimi felt like erasure to Noel Redding. And the Electric Ladyland sessions became the crucible where that tension finally caught fire. The recording of Electric Ladyland began in late 1967 and stretched across the first half of 1968, swallowing entire months in a marathon of studio obsession that had no precedent in rock music. Jimi did not simply want to record an album. He wanted to build a world, a sonic landscape that existed between dimensions, where blues and jazz and soul and feedback and tape manipulation and pure electrical experimentation fused into something that had never existed in recorded music before. Every other rock band in the world was working with established studio conventions. Record the rhythm section, overdub the guitars, add vocals, mix, done. Jimi rejected all of it. He wanted sounds that had no names, textures that had no categories, transitions that followed dream logic instead of song structure. He would spend an entire night recording a single guitar passage, layering it 16 times, playing each layer slightly differently, then erasing 12 of them and starting again because the composite sound was not yet the thing he heard inside his head. But there was a cost to chasing perfection at that velocity, and the first person to pay it was the one standing closest. The first thing Noel noticed was the bass parts. His bass parts. The lines he had written, rehearsed, and recorded were quietly disappearing from the mixes. Not all at once. Not with any announcement or explanation. He would come into the studio expecting to hear the arrangement they had agreed upon and discover that his bass had been replaced, sometimes by Jimi himself, who would pick up the bass and re-record the part at 3 in the morning after Noel had gone home. Sometimes the bass was buried so deep in the mix that it was essentially inaudible, drowned under walls of guitar overdubs that Jimi had added without consulting anyone. Noel would stand in the control room listening to a playback and realize that the song he was hearing was not the song he had helped create. It was Jimi's song now. Entirely. Every note, every texture, every decision. The democracy of the power trio had become a benevolent autocracy, and nobody had bothered to inform the other 2 members that the Constitution had been rewritten. But the bass parts were only the surface of a deeper wound. What truly ate at Noel Redding during those months was the open-door policy that Jimi had established at the record plant. Jimi had started inviting people into the studio. Not professional musicians with specific roles. Anyone, friends, acquaintances, people he had met at parties the night before, girlfriends, fellow guitarists who happened to be in New York. Traffic guitarist Dave Mason wandered through and ended up playing on several tracks. Stephen Stills appeared and contributed. Al Cooper sat in. The studio became a revolving door of guests who sat on couches, drank, smoked, talked, and occasionally picked up instruments and played on tracks that were supposed to belong to the Jimi Hendrix Experience. For Noel, this was not generosity or creative openness. It was betrayal. Every stranger who played a note on those sessions was a message, intentional or not, that the band was replaceable, that Noel was replaceable, that the years of touring, the shared history, the exhausting nights on stages from Monterey to London to the Fillmore meant nothing when weighed against Jimi's desire to fill the room with fresh energy and new sounds. The man who could not look you in the eye during a conversation was filling his studio with strangers, and the man who had been there from day one was standing in the hallway wondering whether he still had a seat inside. And then there was the matter of Chaz Chandler. Chandler had been the Experience's producer from the beginning. A former bassist himself with the Animals. A practical man who understood that great records required focus, deadlines, and financial discipline. He had guided the band through their first 2 albums with efficiency and clarity, shaping the raw, volcanic energy of Jimi's playing into records that were tight, focused, and commercially powerful. But the Electric Ladyland sessions were something Chandler could not control. Jimi wanted unlimited time. Jimi wanted unlimited takes. Jimi wanted to experiment without constraints, to follow sonic ideas down corridors that might lead nowhere, to spend studio money like it was water flowing through his fingers. Accounts from that period describe sessions where Jimi would record 40 or 50 takes of a single passage, searching for a specific feel that he could identify but could not verbally describe to anyone else in the room. The tension between Jimi and Chandler grew week by week until it became unsustainable. Either according to biographies and accounts from people who were present during that period, Chandler eventually walked away from the sessions entirely, selling his share of the management partnership to Michael Jeffrey. The man who had discovered Jimi in a Greenwich Village club, who had brought him to London, who had shaped the early sound of the Experience, left because the artist he had nurtured had outgrown every boundary he tried to maintain. Chandler's departure removed the last structural check on Jimi's studio instincts. Without a producer willing to say no, without someone who could balance artistic ambition against practical reality, the sessions expanded further into uncharted territory. More hours, more takes, more overdubs, more strangers wandering through the control room at all hours of the night, and less room for Noel Redding to feel like he belonged to the thing that carried his name. The night everything came to a head was not dramatically different from any other night at the record plant during those months. The same haze of smoke and exhaustion hung in the air. The same parade of unfamiliar faces occupied the couches. The same sound of Jimi playing guitar at a volume that suggested the rest of the world had stopped existing bled through the studio walls. But something in Noel had finally reached its limit. A wire that had been bending for months finally snapped. He had been sitting in the lounge area for 3 hours while Jimi worked on a guitar part behind the closed door of the main recording room. Nobody had asked him to come in. Nobody had told him the session was over, and he existed in the worst possible professional limbo, present enough to be technically involved, absent enough to be functionally irrelevant. Noel pushed open the studio door and walked in. The room was crowded. Jimi was in his usual position near the console, guitar in hand, nodding along to a playback. 2 people Noel did not recognize sat on the couch against the far wall. A third stranger was adjusting a microphone near the drum kit. The engineer looked tired but focused, the kind of exhaustion that comes from working with someone who does not recognize the concept of a finished take. Mitch Mitchell sat behind his drums, waiting with the patient alertness of a man who had learned to exist in the spaces between Jimmy's decisions. Everyone in the room appeared to have a purpose except the bassist of the band whose name was on the album. What happened next has been described in various accounts from people who were present during the Electric Ladyland sessions, and while the exact words differ depending on who tells the story, the emotional trajectory is consistent across all of them. Noel confronted Jimi, not with shouting, not with thrown instruments, not with the kind of theatrical fury that makes for dramatic retelling. It was quieter than that, and in some ways, quieter made it worse. Noel asked Jimi what was happening to the band. He asked why his bass parts were being replaced without discussion. He asked why strangers were playing on their record. He asked when the last time was that the 3 of them, just the 3 of them, the actual Jimi Hendrix Experience, and had sat in a room together and played music like a band instead of like a solo artist and his rotating cast of session guests. The questions were calm. They were direct. They were the accumulated weight of months of silence finally finding a voice. The room went still. The playback continued rolling in the background, a low wash of guitar and tape hiss that underscored the silence between the 2 men like a soundtrack to something breaking apart. The strangers on the couch seemed to shrink into the cushions. The engineer found something fascinating on the mixing board to stare at. Mitch Mitchell looked at the floor. Jimi did not argue. That was perhaps the most difficult part for Noel to absorb. He did not defend himself, did not explain his creative vision in passionate terms, did not try to convince Noel that the changes were necessary for the music to reach where it needed to go. According to those who were present, Jimi simply listened with that quiet, absorptive stillness that had always been his default setting when confronted with emotional conflict. The same stillness that had sat in the corner of London studios before anyone knew his name. The same stillness that preceded every volcanic performance. He was a man who could scream through 6 strings, but who struggled to speak through his own voice when the conversation required vulnerability. The silence was its own answer, and both men knew it. Jimmy's inability to explain himself was not cruelty or indifference. It was the gap between what he heard inside his head and what he could articulate with words. The music he was building existed in a space beyond language, and asking him to justify it in conversational terms was like asking a painter to explain a color that did not yet have a name. He knew what the album needed to sound like. He could feel it in his chest, in his fingers, in the hum of the amplifier at 2 a.m. when the rest of New York was asleep. He could not explain why that sound required dismantling the collaborative structure that had built the band, but he could not stop pursuing it either. The vision was bigger than the relationship, and standing in that studio, both men understood that truth without anyone needing to say it aloud. Noel left the session that night, not permanently, not yet. He came back the next day and the day after that, and for enough sessions to ensure his name remained on the record. The album continued its long, expensive, agonizing journey toward completion. But something between them had been severed that could not be repaired with time or conversation or shared stages. The confrontation had named the thing they had both been avoiding for months. The Jimi Hendrix Experience, as a band of equals, as the power trio that had conquered London and Monterey and the world, was already over. What remained was a name, a contractual obligation, and a stage arrangement that placed three musicians in a triangle formation while only one of them controlled the geometry. Electric Ladyland was released in October of 1968, and it was immediately recognized as something extraordinary, a double album that pushed every boundary of what rock music could contain. The production was vast, layered, psychedelic in the truest sense, and technically innovative in ways that would take other musicians years to comprehend, let alone replicate. Critics recognized its ambition. Musicians studied its techniques. Listeners found themselves inside a sonic world that felt genuinely new, as if someone had discovered an additional dimension and figured out how to press it into vinyl. But inside that masterpiece, if you listen carefully with the knowledge of what happened during its creation, you can hear the cost. You can hear it in the bass parts that shift between players across the track list, some clearly Noel's careful lines, some clearly Jimi's more instinctive approach, some played by guests whose contributions blur the boundary between band record and solo project. You can hear it in the sheer density of the guitar overdubs, layers upon layers that suggest a musician who no longer trusted anyone else to fill the sonic space he was imagining. You can hear it in the drum parts, where Mitch Mitchell plays with the controlled intensity of someone who knows the ground beneath him is shifting, but who has decided to keep playing anyway, to hold the rhythm steady even as everything around him transforms. In the months that followed the album's release, the fractures that had been private became public. Noel Redding began speaking to journalists about his frustration with the recording process. Not with bitterness exactly, but with the resigned clarity of someone who had accepted an outcome he could not change. He spoke about feeling sidelined, about the open studio policy, about discovering his bass parts had been replaced. He spoke about the paradox of loving the music but losing the band, about the difference between being in a group and being an employee of someone else's genius. Jimi, when asked about the tensions in interviews during that period, deflected with the practiced vagueness of someone who did not want to discuss the human side of his creative process. He spoke about the music, about the sounds he was chasing, about the future of what electric instruments could accomplish when freed from conventional recording methods. He did not speak about Noel's pain or Mitch's patience or the relationships that his perfectionism had strained to the point of fracture. Not because he did not care. Those who knew him well described a man who carried quiet guilt about the way the band dynamic had shifted, who wanted to be a good bandmate and collaborator, but who could not compromise on the sounds he heard inside his head. The perfectionism that made Electric Ladyland a landmark was the same force that made the experience impossible to sustain. The band played their final concert together in June of 1969 at the Denver Pop Festival. Accounts from that period describe a performance marked by tension, exhaustion, and the audible strain of three musicians who were no longer moving in the same direction. The music was still powerful, still electric, still capable of commanding an audience through sheer sonic force. But the chemistry that had once made the trio feel like a single organism playing through three bodies had dissipated. Three musicians performing on the same stage without truly playing together. The difference was audible to anyone who had seen them in their early days, when the interplay between guitar, bass, and drums carried the conversational intimacy of three people who could finish each other's musical sentences. After Denver, Noel Redding left the Jimi Hendrix Experience. The departure was framed as mutual in press statements, the diplomatic language that the music industry uses when relationships end badly but legally. The reality was the conclusion of a process that had begun months earlier in that studio hallway, During those long nights when a bassist stood outside a closed door listening to the muffled sound of his own parts being erased and rebuilt by someone else. Jimi moved forward with the relentless momentum that defined his creative life. He formed new musical partnerships. He played Woodstock with a different lineup, delivering a performance that would become one of the most iconic moments in rock history. He assembled the Band of Gypsies with Billy Cox and Buddy Miles for a brief, explosive chapter that pushed his music toward funk and rhythm and blues. He continued building Electric Lady Studios in Greenwich Village, designing a space that would serve his vision instead of constraining it. The creative restlessness that had consumed the experience was not a phase or a flaw. It was the fundamental engine of his artistry. He would always be chasing the next sound, the next texture, the next impossible combination of frequencies that existed just beyond the limits of what his current collaborators could provide. But those who spent time with him during that final period describe a man who occasionally looked backward with something that resembled regret. Not regret for the music, never for the music. Regret for the human cost. Jimi reportedly spoke about missing the simplicity of the trio format, the specific chemistry that Noel and Mitch had brought to his earliest recordings. There is something about a band that forms before fame, before money, before the machinery of the industry gets its hands on the relationships. Something irreplaceable. The three of them had been broke together in London, had shared terrible food in cold hotel rooms, had played to half-empty clubs while waiting for the world to decide whether they mattered. That shared origin creates a bond that later success can strain but never fully replicate, no matter how talented the new collaborators might be. Jimi Hendrix died in September of 1970, less than 2 years after Electric Ladyland's release. He was 27 years old. The studio he had poured himself into was barely open. He had plans for new albums, new collaborations, new sonic territories that existed only as sketches and fragments on tape. The restless creative engine was still running at full speed when it stopped forever. Noel Redding spent the following decades in Ireland, playing in smaller bands, writing music that never reached the audience his work with Jimi had found. In interviews across the years, he was capable of remarkable nuance about the Experience era, separating his personal frustrations from his genuine appreciation for what Jimi had accomplished. Yes, he acknowledged that Electric Ladyland was a masterpiece. He understood, with the perspective that distance provides, why Jimi had needed to push beyond the band's boundaries to create it. He simply wished the process had not required dismantling the thing he valued most. The feeling of being in a real band. The feeling of being needed. The tragedy of that confrontation at the record plant is not that it happened. Confrontations happen in every band, in every creative partnership, in every relationship where two people want different things from the same shared enterprise. The tragedy is that both men were entirely right. Noel was right that a band should function as a collaborative unit, that a bassist deserves to play his own parts on his own record, that a studio session should not feel like an open audition where your position might be filled by whoever wanders through the door at midnight. Those are reasonable expectations. Those are the foundations that make musical partnerships sustainable across years and albums and tours. And Jimi was right that the music demanded more than the existing structure could provide. Electric Ladyland required sounds that did not exist in the vocabulary of a standard rock trio. It required experimentation that could not be scheduled, collaboration that could not be predicted, and a level of sonic perfectionism that was fundamentally incompatible with the democratic rhythms of band life. The album that emerged from those sessions changed popular music permanently. Its influence echoes through virtually every genre that followed, from progressive rock to electronic music to modern production techniques that treat the recording studio itself as an instrument to be played. 2 truths, 1 studio. Not enough room for both. Every time someone puts on Electric Ladyland, they are hearing the sound of a band being simultaneously elevated to its creative peak and torn apart by the process of reaching it. The beauty and the destruction are inseparable. The breakthrough and the breakdown share the same address. And somewhere inside those layers of guitar and bass and drums and tape manipulation and studio experimentation, you can still hear the echo of a quiet confrontation between two men who wanted the same thing: great music, but could not agree on what it should cost. That was the truth about the Jimi Hendrix Experience. The name was always honest. It was Jimi's experience. Everyone else was along for the ride, and the ride, extraordinary as it was, could never last forever, because the man driving it could not stop long enough to ask whether his passengers still wanted to go where he was headed,